you were in Texas in the 1990s, it was definitely considered a crime. And if you were Oprah Winfrey, you took this action really seriously. Because this is the story of how Oprah Winfrey, who at the time was arguably the most powerful woman in the world, how she went head to head with one of the most powerful industries in the United States at the time. Back in the 90s, there was a crisis all about mad cow disease. No, Ariel, I'm not talking about you. You're not a mad cow. You're a happy cow, actually, girl. Very good girl. Yes, you are. Yes, that's right, folks. I have another farm crime story for you. This isn't a crime story that involves murder, or bank robbery, or a kidnapping, but it is a situation where talking about food could have potentially been a crime. And this crime story pitted Oprah Winfrey, arguably the most powerful woman in the world, against the beef industry of the United States, arguably one of the most powerful lobbying groups in the United States, and without a doubt, arguably one of the most powerful industries within Texas. And those two titans went head-to-head in a clash that played out in a courtroom in Amarillo, Texas. But in order to tell this story properly, I probably need to go back a couple years earlier to 1996, which is where Oprah Winfrey's beef began. You see, because back in April of 1996, on the Oprah Winfrey Show, Oprah did this whole episode about food safety. You see, at the time, there was a lot of concern about outbreaks of what was commonly called mad cow disease taking place in England. And folks in the United States, even though there hadn't been any outbreaks or cases here inside the United States, were starting to become concerned. And so in this food safety episode, what had happened was Oprah Winfrey had this guy by the name of Howard Lyman on her show. Howard Lyman was this former Montana farmer/rancher who had given up farming in order to become a lobbyist and a vegetarian advocate. To hear him tell the story, it basically goes that he got sick with a tumor. He blamed the tumor on the beef that he was eating, and that made him go vegetarian, and that made him start working in Washington to become a lobbyist, where he swore off eating cattle and beef and really felt like everybody should be leading a vegetarian lifestyle. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And so Howard Lyman was very active in the mid-90s talking about vegetarianism and some of the evils of the beef industry. And now one of the things that Howard Lyman would talk about on a regular basis was how the beef industry would often supplement the feed of cattle with animal proteins.
You gotta tell them, silent breed is people!
Even more specifically, Howard Lyman would often talk about animals rendered down and added to the meal and feed that were given to cattle. Whether it be roadkill, or dead dogs and cats, or even dead cattle that were killed on a feeding lot, those animals would often be processed and given to the cattle as feed. And a lot of folks theorize that the fact that the cattle were eating other animals and eating meat, which are something that cattle never evolved to do, was actually the cause of BSE, which is often colloquially known as mad cow disease. Now, how prevalent was it that cattle were being added to the feed of other cattle is still a little bit of a mystery, but there are documented cases where that is true, and where, especially back in the 90s, they were feeding cattle meat, which is never a good thing to feed an herbivore. I mean, heck, on my farm, we only feed our cattle hay and grass. And I would argue that doing anything like feeding them corn or grain or other sorts of foods is a bad thing. Making your cattle cannibals is absolutely atrocious. And again, I'm not here today to talk about whether or not that is the case that happened in the 90s, but the point of my bringing it up is that Howard Lyman brought it up when he was on the Oprah Winfrey Show talking about food safety. And when Oprah Winfrey heard that the hamburger that she might have just eaten the night before was being fed other cattle, she kind of freaked out. In fact, the direct quote from Oprah was, "Now, doesn't that concern you all a little bit right there, hearing that? It has just stopped me cold from eating another burger. I'm stopped." Which I would actually say is understandable. You know, for me personally, I only eat meat when I personally know the farm that it came from and the practices that that farm uses. And Oprah's comments were from a time back when it was perfectly legal to feed cattle other cattle. And so even though I'm a beef farmer myself, I actually understand where she's coming from on that one. And directly while Howard Lyman was on Oprah's show, he talked about how the cattle were being fed downer cows or dead cows that couldn't get up, and so they were, killed and then ground up and used as a cheap source of protein for the other cattle that were still alive. He talked about how like the offal from butchering was often put in there, or how manure was put in there. You know, he was spinning a pretty gosh darn scary story. You know, even in this day and age, at a lot of feedlots, they're still feeding their cattle crap. You know, for example, in the current beef industry, it's called alternative feed sources, but it really is all about how do you feed cattle garbage other than, say, hay or letting them graze fresh grass, which is what the cattle are designed to do. You know, for example, in 2017, there was like a mysterious deposit of like tons and tons and tons of red Skittles. Yes, red Skittles.
Pet the rainbow, taste the rainbow.
And at first, authorities were stumped as to the source of all these mysterious red Skittles. But what turned out to have happened was there was a feed truck that was going to a feed lot for cattle. Through some sort of weird accident, it deposited all of those Skittles. And so they were actually trying to feed the cattle Skittles, which based on current United States government regulations is totally legal. Again, this is why grass-fed beef is so important. In fact, to quote a livestock nutritionist who works for Great Plains Livestock Consulting, they actually said that the Skittles were a very good way for producers to reduce feed cost and to provide less expensive food for consumers. But my personal opinion would be garbage in, garbage out. But I digress. Back in 1997, the Food and Drug Administration updated some of their guidelines, and at this point, the full list of things you can't feed cattle include unborn calf carcasses, dehydrated garbage, fleshings and hydrosate. I don't even think I said that right, but you get the idea. Like, if an industry explicitly has to be told not to feed their cattle these things, you really do have to wonder about that industry. And while you're also not allowed to feed cattle the meat and meat byproducts from cows and other mammals, there are some notable exceptions, such as blood products, milk products, gelatin from mammals, pig, and horse meat. And also non-mammal protein sources such as fish, poultry, and veggies are also okay. Yes, our United States government says that this is okay to feed cattle. So now back to our story. You've got Howard Lyman on the Oprah Winfrey show talking about these awful practices. You've got Oprah saying she's not going to be eating beef anymore.
She didn't say to the millions of viewers, you shouldn't eat them.
And you also have to recognize that this is 1990s Oprah Winfrey at the height of her powers, Oprah. At that point in time, you couldn't turn on the TV or look at a magazine cover without seeing Oprah somewhere, somehow. She was like this one-woman media empire giving away cars. And making book recommendations and listing off her favorite things. In fact, I think if you look at the modern social media influencer industry, a lot of that is owed to Oprah and how influential she was in the 1990s. So while Oprah's comments might not seem like a big deal to us today, at the time the world was freaking out over every little thing she said. And after that episode aired, it was like cattle prices dropped overnight. According to some estimates, the price of live cattle dropped by about 10%, reaching a 10-year low after Oprah's comments. And so the folks in the United States cattle industry were understandably irate because of Oprah's comments. In fact, one of the cattle industry's major cheerleaders at the time was Rick Perry. You guys remember Rick Perry, right?
Commerce, education, and
You know, Rick Perry eventually went on to be the governor of Texas, and he was the United States Secretary of Energy under Trump. But at the time, he was the Secretary of Agriculture in the state of Texas. Within days of Oprah's comments, Perry wrote a letter to the Attorney General of Texas saying that Oprah Winfrey should be charged based on a new law on the books in Texas. Specifically, he said, "The economic livelihood of our beef producers is at stake, and I trust agriculture can count on the Attorney General's office to enforce the laws of the state of Texas." Now, you might be hearing this and wondering, well, how could somebody get charged or arrested over saying that they're not going to eat beef anymore? Well, back in the 90s, many states were passing what were known as Veggie libel laws, or in Texas, it was called the False Disparagement of Perishable Food Products Law. The law was designed to protect the agricultural industry and basically said you couldn't disparage a food product particularly when it related to health risks or safety issues. This law allowed food producers to sue the people who might have made those statements, even if those statements were provably true or made in good faith. Now, you might be hearing all of this and saying, golly, that sounds like a real First Amendment nightmare. And let me just tell you, my friends, it absolutely was. These laws had the effect of silencing any criticism of the agricultural industry, and it really placed the burden of proof on the defendant to prove what they were saying was actively true, not demonstrably false. And as these veggie libel laws popped up around the country, organizations like the ACLU and others started to challenge them because they were such a detriment to free speech. And while Texas's Attorney General at the time said that Oprah Winfrey's statements were baloney. And so while the state of Texas wasn't going to pursue charges against Oprah Winfrey, that's when the Texas ranchers decided to make this thing civil. Or I guess more accurately, a little bit uncivil. And specifically, this guy Paul Engler and his company decided to sue Oprah directly. He also sued Harpo Productions, which was Oprah's production company. He sued Howard Lyman, who was the guy who was on Oprah's show talking about the practices. And there's probably other entities that were getting named in this suit too, but obviously the marquee name was, of course, Oprah Winfrey. Now, it's probably also worth me taking a moment to talk a little bit about Paul Engler, because he's kind of an interesting and important figure in this story as well. He was the lead plaintiff in this lawsuit, and he was also the founder of Cactus Feeders. And you might be saying to yourself, gosh, Morgan, what's Cactus Feeders? Well, let me tell you about it. So Paul Engler was, and I guess is because he's still alive and in his 90s at this point, he was this guy from Nebraska who moved to the Texas Panhandle with the idea of starting feedlots. So whereas our farm has our cattle on pasture for the majority of the year and they're grazing grass rotationally, and then we have a winter lot where we're feeding them hay, feedlots are these operations that take semi-mature cattle, bring them all together in one place, pump them full of as much high-calorie food as possible, fatten them up for slaughter, and then send them off to the meatpacking plant. Have you ever heard the expression of a concentrated animal feed operation, or a CAFO or CAFO? And most of the beef that you guys are probably eating here in the United States comes from these feedlots that still exist and proliferate across America today. When you think about the ecological nightmare that cattle can be, it's because of these feedlot practices and what they look like. And Paul Engler is like the godfather, grandfather of feedlot activity. This notion of packing as many cattle into one small area as possible and getting them as much food as possible is what made Paul Engler a multimillionaire. And it also had made him one of the most powerful cattlemen at the time in the United States. As I was doing the research, actually a Texas periodical described him in a 1990s article as, the 68-year-old Engler is all male, as tough as a fence post. A frame photo of a double-barreled shotgun permanently cocked at visitors hangs over his desk. He's known as a bit of a hellion. He once got so furious upon hearing himself called a farmer on television that he told his attorney, if that guy calls me a farmer again, you sue his ass. And yes, this was the guy who was suing Oprah Winfrey's keister, the father of the feedlot.
The biggest challenges that we have today facing this industry is our federal government.
A guy by the name of Stan Marsh, not to be confused with South Park's Stan Marsh. He was a guy who owned a local TV station in the 90s and was a friend of Paul Engler's. And he actually has this funny story of how Paul Engler would take people up in his helicopter and fly over his feedlots, and you'd get this crazy impressive view of like all of these feedlots, and then you would see these lakes, and it would look like the lakes were like golden yellow because the sun was setting off in the distance. And it was like magic hour going on there. But then as he would have the pilot lower the helicopter, you would realize that that lake was an entire lake filled of urine. And it was just urine from the feedlots, which is absolutely disgusting. And back to the idea of why these things are ecological nightmares, that just gives you a little bit of a taste.
Have you been eating asparagus?
Yeah. So essentially you had this battle of Oprah Winfrey versus Paul Engler, and it was a $12 million lawsuit that was at stake. And now I'd be remiss in telling this story if I didn't bring up the fact that there was a racial element to what was going on here. All ducks go to bed! All ducks go to bed! All ducks go to bed! I mean, while the trial itself didn't revolve around race, you have to recognize you did have this predominantly white male industry going head-to-head with the objectively most powerful woman of color in the United States. And race and public perception played a role in things. A number of the critics of the lawsuit actually even explicitly said that these cattle ranchers were trying to silence a powerful black woman. And as news of the lawsuit spread and the hype in Amarillo for a court trial began, and there were some pretty questionable things that were popping up. Like, for example, there were like bumper stickers that were pretty popular at the time in Texas that said that the only mad cow was Oprah Winfrey. Not cool, you guys, not cool. Now, regardless of those dynamics and perceptions, the cattlemen pushed ahead with their lawsuit, and things stopped looking like they were going to be able to settle it out of court, and it looked like they were heading towards a trial. Now, as folks have analyzed this whole thing after the fact, many folks have said that this is a perfect example of the Streisand Effect and what happened with this case in this trial. And for those of you guys not familiar with the Streisand Effect, when somebody who's trying to suppress a certain type of information like goes out and acts and talks about the fact that they're trying to suppress it, which then ends up drawing even more attention to that thing, like it sort of all snowballs. And so if you just kind of let it happen and ignore it and move on, maybe the impact and perception and awareness of that thing wouldn't have been so impactful. The term actually originated in 2003 when Barbra Streisand sued this photographer for taking aerial photos of her home, and because of the lawsuit, it actually drew more attention to her home and where the location was. I can also think of an example where this Nudnik farmer in Vermont complained about hound hunters coming on his property, which probably also led to even more hound hunters coming on his property. If the cattle ranchers were so concerned about people having misperceptions about their beef and thinking that their beef was unhealthy, having a lawsuit talking about how their beef potentially caused mad cow disease, and having certain facts like the fact that they were in fact feeding their herbivore animals animal byproduct, that might not have been the best way to suppress that perception. But I digress. Good night, birds. Because both sides were not able to settle the case out of court, a trial became imminent, and that trial was going to take place in Amarillo, Texas. Now, for those of you guys not familiar with Amarillo, Texas, Amarillo is a town of, 170, 180,000 people, I guess, back then. I mean, the main industry of Amarillo, Texas, and really that whole region and part of Texas was all about raising beef, particularly the feedlot beef that Paul Engler was known for. Hey, get out of there, cat. Get out of there. And when I say that Amarillo was a beef town, I mean within 150 miles of Amarillo, Texas, you had about 6 million head of cattle. Who's up, Toby Dog? That means it's a third of the nation's beef supply within 150 miles of a town where this beef trial was taking place. To say that the cattle ranchers had a home court advantage in this trial would have been an understatement. But then again, they were going up against the most powerful woman in the world. And the media circus that was guaranteed to accompany Oprah coming to Amarillo for the trial was the equivalent of having like the O.J. Simpson trial in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It was just going to be bonkers. So to say Oprah Winfrey going to Amarillo brought on a media circus would have been an understatement, actually, because there were like quotes from the mayor of Amarillo at the time talking about like 22 different satellite trucks showing up and just how the whole town got taken over. It was absolute bedlam what was happening inside Amarillo, and everybody had Oprah to thank for it.
Oprah Winfrey is in Texas facing a federal lawsuit claiming defamation of the American beef.
I mean, you essentially had the biggest employer in the region going head to head with the biggest celebrity in the United States. It was hard for that not to turn into a three-ring circus. But the thing about Oprah going to Amarillo was it just wasn't Oprah going to Amarillo. You see, Oprah Winfrey also brought the Oprah Winfrey Show with her to Amarillo. At the time, Oprah Winfrey was contractually obligated to do 200 episodes of the Oprah Winfrey Show every single year. That's a lot of shows. And because of the fact that a trial could go, a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, you don't even really know. It's an indefinite period of time. She couldn't just stop production of the show, or she would be actually liable for defaulting on her contract. And at that point, it was like millions and millions of dollars at stake. And so what Oprah decided to do was take her show, which was produced in Chicago, and bring it on the road down to Amarillo, Texas. And so Oprah started doing episodes of the Oprah Winfrey Show from Texas. And the other thing that was going on though at the time was the judge in the case had barred anybody from talking about the trial. And so there was a gag order in place. And so, people might try to talk about it with Oprah on her show, but she pretty much had to be like, no mas, I can't talk about it. Not gonna say it. And it almost like became a running joke on her show about the fact that she couldn't talk about it on her show.
One surefire way to drive a talk show host crazy is to put a gag order on her.
I mean, this is a person who talks for a living, and she wasn't allowed to talk about the single biggest thing going on in her life at the time, which I could imagine be frustrating. I mean, I would imagine I would struggle with the same thing if I had to do it, and I'm at a way smaller scale than Oprah, but there you go. You know, to have your freedom of speech curtailed because of a trial like that might be as frustrating as having it curtailed by some sort of crazy veggie libel law. So there you have it. Free speech gets hit again. Now, for those legal scholars that are out there looking at this case and saying, well, how strong a case did Engler and the other cattle ranchers have against Oprah? The reality was, it was kind of flimsy. Oprah's comments were clearly in response to something that she was saying. It was offhand. It would have been hard to prove that it was like this systematic approach that she was taking to destroy the beef industry and cause their losses. And even when you look at the episode that featured Howard Lyman talking about the cattle eating cattle, you actually had folks from the cattle industry featured in that episode. So she was even giving an opportunity to voice the other side of the debate. It was going to be very, very difficult for the cattlemen to prove that their losses and the plummeting beef prices were directly a result of Oprah and what she said. I mean, even if you look at the price data of beef at the time, it was already in a slight decline. So to say that like Oprah saying those words like were entirely responsible for a 10% drop in prices, it's really hard to prove something like that. The other weird legal quirk that existed was the law that was on the books was about perishable produce, and it was hard to directly correlate that to livestock, which, you know, has a slightly different market cycle and harvest approach, and you have a little bit more flexibility in terms of when you harvest a steer versus, say, when you harvest an apple. And so with these legal nuances at play, this trial dragged on for 6 whole weeks. Oprah producing her show at night, sitting in the courtroom during the day. There were other people in the courtroom, like, I don't know, Maya Angelou, of all people, who was always showing up at the trial. So it was a circus of a trial. You know, I was a senior in high school at the time when this trial was taking place, and I kind of vaguely remember it being on TV. I definitely remember Howard Stern talking about it on the radio, but I'm not sure if it was actually televised. But the constant coverage at the time was just ongoing. You just have to recognize that, like, this was like almost a daily news item while the trial dragged on, and it went on for 6 weeks. And now you also have to recognize too, this wasn't just like a judge-based trial. This was a trial with a jury involved. And so you have this like two-pronged dilemma. On one hand, this is a trial taking place in Amarillo, Texas, and it's virtually impossible to find a person to serve on a jury in Amarillo, Texas, who didn't have some sort of connection to the beef industry, whether it was directly or through a friend or family member. So that was an aspect that was definitely in favor of the home team, the cattle ranchers. But then at the same time, you had Oprah Winfrey, an exceptionally charismatic woman, one of the biggest celebrities in the world, on trial, sitting directly across from you, the jury, talking to you, the jury. And so you got to imagine that that celebrity magnetism was a little bit at play, and some of those folks might have gotten a little bit starstruck. But, you know, kind of all these factors at play, flimsy court case, slightly biased jury, superstar celebrity, when they all added up and came together on February 26, 1998, the jury found in favor of Oprah and her side in the case.
Free speech not only lives, it rocks.
And so she didn't have to pay the $12 million, and she won. Now, despite Oprah winning, the cattle ranchers and Paul Engler actually kind of tried to declare victory as well, really saying that the attention brought to the beef industry as a result of the trial really helped shift public perception in the right way.
Made one very strong point, very emphatically, very clear to everyone, U.S. beef is safe.
But I gotta say, when I was thinking about all of the mad cow jokes I've heard over the years and the stories of cannibal cows and things that you see in like books like Food Inc. that came out after this trial, I struggle to see that. And in fact, if you even look at what regenerative farmers like myself are doing today, I feel like a lot of it's very much in a direct response to the style of raising livestock that was really brought to the forefront of the American consciousness as a result of this trial. Like, I actually wonder, would I be a cattle farmer today if this trial hadn't happened. You know, at the time of the late 90s, the regenerative food movement really was not a thing. You know, organic was only vaguely talked about and was really just seen as a thing that hippies did. Like, none of that stuff mattered, or none of that stuff was like really relevant at that time. And it really was a result of things that happened after this trial, and sometimes as a result of this trial, that it really came from. So I think that, you know, that was definitely a positive that came out of the trial, but I don't think it's the same positive that somebody like Paul Engler thinks it is. I think the other thing, though, that did come as a result of this was that a lot of those veggie libel laws that were springing up in the early 90s and mid 90s were all knocked down. In fact, even the Texas law that served as the foundation for the Oprah Winfrey mad cow case was actually struck down by the Texas Supreme Court in 1999 because it violated free speech. So a lot of those laws have gone bye-bye as a result. But I do think that the media had become more cautious about what they said about food producers as a result of this case as well. But arguably, if you look at this trial and this case and its impact on America, the single biggest horrible thing that happened and came out of it was something very, very subtle that you'd have to look very closely at. Like, for example, look at this picture of Oprah Winfrey on the steps of the courthouse immediately after she won her trial. And do you guys notice this fellow right here in the corner? Let's see if we can get some different footage. You see it? Do you see it? Yes, that's right. Dr. Phil is a direct player in this trial. It was crazy. So Dr. Phil was brought in to help coach Oprah for how she worked with the jury. So Oprah met Dr. Phil as a result of this trial. And so if this trial had not happened, we would have never had Oprah meeting Dr. Phil. Oprah would have never given Dr. Phil a platform to let him come to the world. Dr. Phil and like the Dr. Philification of America is directly as a result of this trial as well. And so that's something definitely awful that came out of the mad cow disease trial. So yes, I hope you've enjoyed this latest edition of the Farm Crime series. I'll be back again with another episode really soon. But until then, why don't you watch one of these lovely videos? Thanks for watching, everybody.